Thanks very much, Nairi. Okay, I hope I'm not too loud now. Okay, as Nairi mentioned, what the title of my talk is Themes, Plugins and Accessibility. And a little bit about me. Nairi sold me a bit earlier already, so I'll just tell you what a web accessibility consultant does. Specifically in my case, I work with organisations to help improve their websites and web products. And typically I test websites for accessibility, and then I work with site owners and developers to actually create solutions for the accessibility issues that we've found. I'm also a WordPress developer in my spare time, and I've developed a few accessible websites for businesses, charities, etc., etc. This is a picture of me at WordCamp Sheffield. I present on accessibility a few times, and I also was, like Jenny, I was at WordCamp London last year. And this presentation I'm about to give, this is a kind of a rehearsal because I'm actually delivering it at WordCamp Europe in about 10 days' time. Okay, so what I'm going to cover. Now, my aim with this presentation is to cover off a bit about accessibility and try and encourage people to think about accessibility when they're building themes. I'm going to talk, and Jenny mentioned it slightly already, about the WordPress theme review process and the accessibility ready tag, but it's kind of like, it's the theme review guidelines, which is what people follow to get their theme up onto the repository. Are actually a good basis for anyone who's building their own themes, and the accessibility guidelines that are part of it is what I'm going to cover in this talk. There's going to be a very tiny bit right at the start about why I believe that accessibility really matters and why I think you should take it seriously. And then right at the end I'm going to talk a bit about plugins and accessibility as well. Okay, the first section, what's all the fuss about? I've been in accessibility for nearly 15 years now. WordPress has only been like the last 4 years at that time. I've worked for a number of organisations helping them out. And over the years I've worked with people who are blind with motor impairments and stuff like that, and people with deafness. Why it's important. Just before I start, does everyone understand what web accessibility means? Is anyone not quite sure what it's all about? Okay, well volunteers. The web accessibility is about how you can make your websites accessible to as many people as possible, and that's including people with disabilities, blindness being the obvious one, motor impairment being another one, so say people have lost the use of their arms or their hands, deafness, there's cognitive impairments like dyslexia, autism, and a whole slew of things. So that's what accessibility is. Now, why it's important is that it affects more people than you think. Now, blindness is an obvious disability. If you see people walking down the street with a guide dog or a white stick, that's pretty fairly obvious that they might be blind. But people with dyslexia, people with autism, people who are deaf even, people with some motor impairments, they're not that obvious. So you kind of don't realise how many people could be affected by the issues where accessibility can help out. Also, the populations are growing older. My parents are in their 80s now, and their eyesight is nowhere near as good as it used to be. That's why mine's going that way as well. They need to have things like text a lot bigger than perhaps most of us in this room would. And also they need things to be a bit more simple than most of us in this room would. Now, they would never consider themselves anywhere near having a disability or an impairment, but there's a lot of people like them in this country and throughout the world. And of course, if you combine these two groups together, people who have disabilities, who have trouble with websites, and people who are elderly, there's quite a big significant spending power in those two groups. There are also legal frameworks. I don't bang about the legal frameworks too much, but suffice to say that many countries in the world have legal frameworks, including the UK. We have the Equality Act. There are other European countries and North American countries, and Australia and a few other ones as well have legal frameworks about this. We're not as litigious in this country as other countries, like for example in America, and there's been a challenge to the Americans with Disabilities Act recently, where some of the big web companies try to say that actually it doesn't really cover them, but it's expected that the Department of Justice will rule soon that actually websites are covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, and expect a huge rush to make websites accessible after that. Of course, accessibility is morally the right thing to do. Accessibility, most of it is actually not difficult to do, as I hope to demonstrate as we go through the accessibility theme review guidelines in a bit more detail. And if you know how to do it, then why wouldn't you? Now, this is a screenshot. Does everyone know who that is, by the way? Anyone unsure? Okay. Yeah, okay. That's a picture of Matt Mullenweg, who is the co-founder of WordPress. He's American. Oh, is he American? No, he's Dutch, isn't he? Is that right? American, right, okay. And he was one of the co-founders. Mike Little, who was English, is the other co-founder. Matt Mullenweg is effectively in charge of the organisation, if that's the right word, probably the totally wrong word. Anyway, this is a screenshot from an interview he gave about 18 months ago on how open source, and in fact, he's talking more about WordPress here, was democratising the web. Now, he's been very successful with that because WordPress actually powers something like 20% of the world's websites now, more than that, either through WordPress.org or WordPress.com sites. And in his presentation, he talked a bit about one of the things that he was focusing on was internationalization, where WordPress is available in many different languages. And in fact, WordPress is available, if you're using the admin screens, in 2 versions of Norwegian. Who knew? But actually, people have pointed out to him, myself included, that actually there are more people who are blind in the world than speak Norwegian. And so it's very important that actually WordPress actually can get its act together. Because as I mentioned about the legal frameworks, there's a danger that if WordPress can't deliver accessible websites, or if you build sites for your clients and they are not accessible, then WordPress is automatically ruled out as a solution for many government sites, council sites, education sites, etc. throughout the world, any public service sites, and potentially private sites as well. So, the main body of what I'm going to talk about is the theme review process and accessibility. Now, themes, Jenny sort of kind of travelled all over my pitch here a little bit. Hands up who's built themes for themselves, for their own website. Excellent, quite a few of you. Okay, also, who's built themes for various clients? Whether it's their own themes or child themes, whatever. Okay, that's good. And I can't remember how many people put their hands up at the end, but how many people have built themes that are on the WordPress repository? No, not many of you here. So you think, well, what's this to do with me? Well, even if you haven't built any themes at all, and all you've done is downloaded a theme from WordPress, if you're interested in accessibility, you want to know that actually it's going to deliver what you want. Now, the theme review guidelines, I'm not going to go massive amount of detail with this bit, but there's a whole page on the codex that Jenny mentioned that tells you about the theme review process. And there's a whole test thing to go through. It covers such things as coding standards, how to use various action hooks, etc., what template files need to be included. And there's a whole load of advice in there about building themes that's relevant even if you're not building a theme to put on the WordPress repository, because it's a list of best practices. That's what it is, effectively. And within that, buried within that page, there's a section on accessibility that's quite new. And if you look at the link there, it says Guidelines Accessibility. And what that link points to is this page. And this is the page that I'm going to talk a bit more about. It's the official version, and it's going to be updated quite soon. But this tells you all the things that you need to do to actually make your thing accessible and go for, as it says at the top, the Accessibility Ready tag. Now, why accessibility ready, you might ask? Well, I'll cover this in a bit more detail later, but suffice to say that it's not the theme is not the only thing about a WordPress website that can influence the accessibility. And there are other things too, like for example, an admin might add a plugin to the site or a number of plugins. They can affect accessibility, as we'll see in a bit more detail later on. Also, they let content authors loose on it, and both of those things can actually mess up the accessibility of a website that's using a good accessible theme. So the tag is called accessibility ready rather than accessible, because it wouldn't be fair to describe it as accessible just because it uses that theme. Now, the sections within the accessibility area here's the list of them. I'm not going to read them all out. You can see them all, and I'm just going to briefly spin through these to talk about the key elements. Now, if you need to know in more detail what's actually in the guidelines, I suggest you go and have a look at the links in this presentation, which I will be uploading to SlideShare very soon, perhaps tomorrow or the day after. And I will mention that on Twitter when I do that. Okay, so talking about images first. Some of you will know this stuff because you've heard me talk about it before, but the legal guidelines say that if you're using decorative images on your site, this is images that don't convey any meaning, but potentially are there just to create a mood, or just a colour, or a background if you like, or something like that. It's best to include them as background images in CSS. If you can't do that, if they have to be foreground images for some reason, then you need to make sure that you have the empty return text, or the empty alt attribute there. And I mentioned alt attribute especially there because the guidelines talk about if you're, when people are putting content in your pages and they're putting images into those pages themselves, WordPress tends to handle that for them, either by putting in an empty alt attribute or actually allowing people to specify it. But if your theme is going to allow people to add images, say maybe in the banner, like a header image, or in the footer, or at the top of the sidebar, etc., then you need to make sure there's a sensible alt attribute in there, or give people the people who are using the thing a capability of adding one. Media is the next one. The key takeaway here is that things shouldn't start without user input, and that includes audio and video. Screen reader users are potentially discombobulated here, because if you've got audio or video that starts on your page, it's quite loud, it might just blot out whatever the screen reader is trying to read to the user. It mentions also specifically in the guidelines sliders and carousels. A lot of people are using those on their websites these days, and funnily enough, a lot of people like them to refresh themselves on a regular basis. That's not recommended really, because movement on a page can be really disconcerting for some people. For example, people with dyslexia, people with autism, and other cognitive impairments. Headings. It's good to remember that headings are actually semantic elements. They're not there just for presentation. They actually mean something in the HTML. And the guidelines specify you should use a reasonable HTML heading structure, which means that you want to nest them properly. Although, strictly speaking, in HTML5 you could have a page that consisted entirely of top-level headings, like H1s, really that's not a good idea for people who are using potentially screen readers and stuff like that, and other software which might externalise to them in other ways what's going on within the page. So it's a good idea to nest them properly. The last section there that I talk about is subsections defined by the theme must use headings. E.g. your widget titles. So when someone drags a widget into your sidebar, the title needs to be a heading, and it needs to be at the appropriate heading level for where it sits. Also, post titles. Most things will have a blog page, which is where it lists your last 5, 10 blog posts, which will consist of the title of the blog post, and that's typically going to be a heading and a link. Link text, since we talk about links, you must supply the context in any links that you put on the page. Once again, talking about blog pages, blog index pages, if you've got just read more or find out more or something like that, if you've got a list of links like that on their own, they are not sufficiently meaningful for screen reader users, because screen reader users have this, screen readers have this capability which saves people a lot of time, whereby you can list links that are on a page out of context of the page. And if all you've got is like read more, read more, read more, read more, it just doesn't mean anything, there's no context there. So you must put that in the link. Now it's okay if you don't want to say by a blog post, read more, you can actually make that hidden, and there are CSS techniques that will enable you to do that. That it makes it available for screen readers, but it's not there for sighted users. The other thing that the guideline specifies is you mustn't use their URLs as links. That's not very friendly. Keyboard navigation, now there's a lot to talk about in here because it's quite an important side. People who have motor impairments and people who are blind and using a screen reader, they may not be using the mouse. They're going to be using keyboard interaction, so they're going to be tabbing around pages to find stuff. And so keyboard focus must be visible everywhere. So when you start at the top and tab around, it must be really obvious where focus is. So at the very minimum, you need to make sure that whatever you do for a hover, whatever styles you do for a hover, needs to be there for keyboards as well. Drop-down menus, this is something that a lot of things actually get very wrong. Drop-down menus need to be operable by keyboard only. Now there are lots and lots of websites out there that fail that test. Keyboard navigation must be intuitive, the guidelines say, and what they're talking about there is the tab order must make sense. And what that means is don't use the tab index to influence that, because on every site that uses tab index greater than 0, there's bound to be bits where you get it wrong and it messes up the tab order quite considerably. In certain cases, you will want to use 0 and -1. That's acceptable because it doesn't sort of kind of mess around with the actual order of which things are tabbed to. The other thing that you shouldn't use is access keys. Now, this used to be quite popular and was actually in the early versions of the accessibility guidelines that were introduced in the late 90s. But the problem is, when this is where you might have a certain keystroke that takes you to the home page, a certain keystroke that takes you to the contact us page, and so on. The problem is that the keystrokes can actually hijack keystrokes that are used by, for example, screen readers or other assistive technology. And so you don't know what it's going to mess up for somebody, so please don't use them. And your theme will fail if you do. Colour contrast. Probably an obvious thing is that basically there needs to be adequate colour contrast between the background and any foreground text. If your theme offers a way of users to change the colours, which probably most things do now, that's fair enough because then it's the user to choose. But if your theme offers specific colour schemes, then whoever's doing the theme review on the accessibility side will actually use whatever the default theme colour scheme is. If you actually specify more than one, it's only necessary for one of the colour schemes to actually pass this test, and it would help obviously if it's labelled up as an accessible colour scheme. To know whether or not you've got sufficient colour contrast, there's a ratio that's defined in the WCAG 2 guidelines, which are worldwide accepted guidelines about accessibility. It's quite a complicated algorithm, and so the link that I've included at the bottom there is to a tool that you can download which will help you do that. It's got a colour picker which you can pop onto the background and the foreground, and it will tell you immediately whether or not there's sufficient colour contrast. Skip me. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm in the way. I'm in the way. Well, whilst you're doing that, just have a quick first page. Can I move on now? I'm going to put the slides up so you'll get it from that. Okay. Anyway, skip links. Skip links are links that take you to other parts of the page. Now, you might have noticed these if you've ever toyed around with the last couple of default WordPress themes. Typically, your skip link will appear at the top and it will say jump to content or something like that. These are really useful for people who are blind, who typically will be navigating around using the keyboard or using the facility in their screen readers to get a list of links on the page. But they're also important for people who are motor impaired who might be using the keyboard. And so most websites these days have horizontal navigation near the top. And so obviously the navigation is going to be quite quick to be found if people are tabbing around on your screen. But it might take bits to go through all the navigation and bits and pieces to actually get to the content. And that's what these are for. It's a quick way for people who are relying on the keyboard to actually jump down to the content of your pages. It's sensible to make them the first focusable element on a page. And whilst in an ideal world they will be visible all the time, I understand not many people like that. And so it's acceptable that they will become visible when you tab to them. So normally they will be hidden off the page, they will get focused and they will become visible, and then as soon as you tab away from them, then they hide themselves again. And they need to be at the top so that people can use them. If you're going to do this in your theme, be aware that there's a long-running bug in Chrome, Google Chrome, which means that if you follow an in-page link, although the screen will jump up to wherever you want it to go to, the keyboard focus doesn't follow by default. So you need to do this in JavaScript as well. You need to actively put focus on something in JavaScript for Chrome. Who knows when that's going to be fixed? Forms. All forms that you put, you might be creating a theme that template that does a nice contact form for your clients to use. They've got to have explicitly linked labels so that when screen reader users get to those form fields, they know exactly what they're supposed to put in. It's not enough just to have placeholders or titles. Error messages need to be reachable by screen readers. If you submit a form, obviously you're going to put some message up to say you should have filled that form in, or that's the wrong format or whatever. So you need to make sure that screen readers can get to those forms. And the other thing that's important is that even know that there are submission errors, because that's not always easy to tell. You'll have to talk to me later if you want to find out ways of doing that. Pop-ups, this is the last section that I'm going to mention. Pop-ups, this is where a link or a button maybe pops a new page or a new browser tab, or even a new pop-up, which are very popular in the WordPress admin screens these days. You must warn users first. It's quite disorientating for some people to suddenly be presented or dropped into a new page. Even if you're a blind person and your screen reader tells you that you're in a new page, you've still got the problem then of how they actually get back to where they were before. It's also disorientating for some sighted users as well. So you need to make sure that how you do this works for screen reader users and is also working for people who are sighted. Perhaps you might want to use an icon which implies jumping off somewhere else. As long as you're consistent across the site, that would do. Okay, now earlier in the week I had a look at how many accessible themes there were. There were 2,751 themes in the repository on Monday, and I tried searching for accessibility, accessible and accessibility ready. As you can see the results there. It's not very many, as you can see. The numbers have jumped up a little bit this year since the accessibility ready tag was introduced, but it's still not very many at all. And a lot of the things that are flagged up as accessibility ready, they might work for blogs, but not really for small businesses. And if your clients are small businesses, then that's kind of the thing you need, small business-based web. So WordPress has had its critics this year. This is a post that was written by Morten Van Hendrickson, Norwegian, and he created one of the accessibility ready things this year. And this is a blog post about how he feels, as I do, that the accessibility ready tag ought to be required for all WordPress themes that are submitted to the repository. Because at the moment it's only optional. And his blog post talks about what that is. Someone else picked up after that, WP Tavern, actually picked up on that, and Sarah Gooding, who actually works for, I think, Audrey Capital, or is it Automatic? I can't remember which, picked up that with a much more striking title, WordPress themes suck at accessibility, it's time to fix it. And here's a blog post you might be interested in. This is David Kennedy. He's another member of the Make WordPress accessibility team. He is based in the States, and he's just actually started working with Automatic just in the last couple of weeks. But he built one of the accessibility ready themes that's up there, and this is his blog post about the journey he took to do that. Quite a useful read. Okay, that's all I'm going to talk a bit about. Talk about themes. The next bit I want to talk about is plugins. Now, as Jenny mentioned earlier, when you submit a plugin to the WordPress repository, it goes through a review process as well. But the review process is different, completely different to the themes. What they're looking for there is security issues and what have you. So there is a process, but it's nowhere near as kind of complicated as the theme review process. There's no mention of accessibility in there, but I'm wondering whether or not there could be an accessibility review of plugins, or should there be? Now, the question is, can plugins affect accessibility? I'm going to show you some examples where it might. I've chosen 3 sorts of plugins. These plugins are ones that lots and lots of people are using on their sites. Sliders, Lightbox, and form generator plugins. So if we look at the first one there, slider example. Firstly, can I stop the slider using the keyboard? If it actually is going automatically, you need some way of stopping it. Now, typically, a slider plugin you can get it so that it stops when you hover over it, but is there the corresponding functionality there to actually stop it if your keyboard's in there? Because a lot of sliders actually get messed up when you start to tab around them. The other things that, these things that control next and previous and the navigation buttons in the bottom right-hand corner, are they buttons or links? There is a semantic difference between the two, but whatever they are, do they label their purpose? This particular slider, I forget which one it is now, actually doesn't by default. I've used JavaScript to actually pop some useful information into those links to actually tell people what they're for. And you can do that, by the way. And the other thing is, when you've got big images like that, can I attach alternate text to these images? Hopefully, you'd imagine it would pull whatever the default alternate text is through from your image when you put it into the media section. Okay, Lightbox. This is an example of one of those. You can click on an image, it pops this up, or you can tab around the page to an image, hit the enter key, it pops this up. Typically, what happens with Lightboxes is that focus stays on the page below. It doesn't come into the Lightbox, which leaves you with 2 problems. Firstly, you can't actually then move through to select the next one or the previous one or whatever like that, but also you're stuck in terms of closing it because your focus is somewhere miles away from where the actual controls for the Lightbox are. The other thing is, how do I attach alternate text to these images? If the plugin doesn't take care of that, then it's not going to be there. And the last example is Forms plugin. This is actually for Contact Form 7, which I used to discount as being not very good from accessibility, but I have improved it, I must say. And the first question is, are these labels linked to their input fields? As I mentioned earlier, screen reader users will be lost without the labels being linked to input fields. But the other thing is, you'll notice here I've submitted this form and I've left some of the mandatory fields blank. And so, does the screen reader users get to hear these error messages? So, as we've seen, plugins can affect accessibility. And so I believe that plugin authors, as well as theme authors, ought to start following the theme accessibility guidelines and to potentially avoiding spoiling the accessibility of WordPress websites where they're used. And I'm almost finished now. Remember, I always encourage people to refer to the theme review guidelines, even if they're not actually using, actually going to submit their themes or plugins to WordPress. Because every accessibility step you take makes the web easier for somebody. If you don't feel you're able to, don't try and do it all in one go. Do it a step at a time. It will make life easier for someone along the way. And so I hope you take your next accessibility step soon. Thank you very much. That's all I've got to say. Have you got time for any questions? 5 minutes of questions. Anyone got any questions? Yes, Dan.
Can I just ask, you mentioned about the keyboard navigation.
Yeah. Yes.
Gravity Forms, one of the biggest, most used plugins out there, actively encourages a much larger number on the tab index if you've got more than one form on a page.
Right.
Is there further issues with Gravity Forms and accessibility that you're aware of?
The issues with tab index are that, as some of you may know, and I forget which way around it is if you have some things that have on a page that have tab index and some things that don't, then you have effectively 2 arrays of tab order. And so the browser will go through the first section, the things that have tab index set, in the order that you set it, and then it will then go through the rest of the elements, or it might be the other way around, I forget. So anywhere that uses tab index, if you're going to use tab index, you'll need to make sure that every link on the page has a sensible tab index set. Otherwise, it's going to kind of mess up the tab order for somebody. So if that's what they're doing, then I don't think that's a good idea, really. The best thing to do is to create your pages, your theme, so that the tab order is effectively the order that is within the HTML, and then use styles to lay your page out so that it's all in a sensible order. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Mary?
You talked about semantic headings.
Yes.
And that's obviously a big one for SEO.
Yes.
In terms of your other accessibility things, how beneficial are they for SEO?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. Yeah. Well, there's a saying that goes around accessibility circles that is Google is blind, because when Google comes to your site, it's not going to run any JavaScript on your site. It's going to look at what the plain HTML is, and it will use whatever your plain vanilla, if you will, HTML that's delivered to the pages. So there's evidence that actually a page or theme that's does well. Sorry, mixing my words here. A page that does accessibility well will also bring inherent benefits from search engine optimization as well. Okay. Anything else? Yes, Mark.
More of a comment really. I just look at those statistics about how many themes are accessibility ready. And it was shocking, only, what was it, 20 themes?
Yes.
That were accessibility ready? 13.
13.
And do themes have to be internationalised to be in the WordPress repository? Just wondered.
Well, I don't know. No, Jenny says no.
No, just like if they do, then it's like you were saying, it's
Yes.
almost worth that as well, isn't it? But
Yes, that's right, yes. I mean, that's why I'm giving this talk, as I mentioned, at WordCamp Europe, where there will be probably, I hope, a lot of theme developers. The aim is to sort of try and get those numbers up, because if you want an accessibility ready theme, you've got such a limited selection now. And I just want it to be bigger. Jenny?
As a theme developer, like you said, throughout your talk, learning what to put into your theme to make it accessible is kind of daunting, and there's such a big long list. Is there a one-place website that you can just go to and set, kind of like a checkbox? Yes, all the images are backgrounds, or they have alt text, whatever. Is there anything like that on the internet that you know of?
The short answer is not really, no. The WCAG 2 guidelines, which is the sort of like the internationally recognised
Isn't that
accessibility.
painful to read though?
No, it's a bit like WordPress Codex used to be. It's really impenetrable unless you know what you're talking about. You've got to be around it for some time. That's why I put together that presentation on how do I know if my WordPress website's accessible, which sort of kind of distills it down into sort of 16 yes/no questions you can ask about your site. And there isn't really, unfortunately. There needs to be like a developer's guide to accessibility. I'm thinking of writing one. It's my pet project, but of course, when do I have time to do that?
Right.
I'll write it this evening. I'll publish it tomorrow. Right? Okay. I guess that's probably about it, isn't it? Thank you very much, everybody.